Hello everyone, welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to be building a slider control. If you go through the tutorials in our channel, you can see that we pretty much covered all the customizable web elements that you can create using CSS and making and adding interactions using JavaScript to them. But the only one that we didn't talk about is the slider control, and I'm very excited and happy to show you how you can create a slider control like this, right? So without further ado, let's get started. As always, I'm going to kotos.com, going to the front end online editor over here. I'll start with creating a container, and then within the container, I'm just going to create a slider container, right? Going to give a little bit of a style. So the container, I want it to have a width of 60%, and then let's give it a margin of 100 pixels, maybe top and bottom, and also make it auto left and right, or left and right, so that it gets centered. Um, the most important thing for you to know is that you don't really need this container. When I put container in my tutorials, it means that that this container is anything you have in your page. Any parent container that you put your actual slider in is in. So the actual container markup starts from here. So now what I would like to do is within the slider container, I'm going to create a div called with the class track, right? And I'm going to slider container my CSS. I'm going to style it, so I will give it a width of 100% and height of maybe 4 pixel, giving it a background of CCC. You can see that now we have our sort of slider track. The next thing I want to do is to add the actual progress, right? So I'm going to create a div called progress within the track. And this is going to be the blue sort of slider progress you can see over here, right? So I'm going to style it. So slider container and then track and then progress. And this will have the same width, 100% on the width, and height can be 100%. And then I'll give it a background of tomato, right? You can see that it pretty much covers the length or the width of the track, right? The next thing I would like to add is within the slider container, I'm going to add another div for the thumb, right? So we have the thumb here. I'm going to style it. So slider container dot thumb. I will give it a width of maybe 20 pixel and height of 20 pixel, and then maybe background of tomato. And since it needs to freely move, I'm going to make sure that I'll give it a position absolute, right? So now we have the position absolute. Now we need a little bit of an adjustment to the top. So the top will be maybe something like minus 8 pixel. You can see that it jumped over here. We need to make sure that the parent container of the thumb, which is a slider, is having a position relative, right? So here I will define position relative, and you can see that it automatically adjusts itself, right? The next thing I would like to do is basically give it a border radius of 50 pixel so that it's round and nice. But one important thing to notice is if I give it an opacity of 0.3, for example, you'll see that the left side of the circle is aligned with the left side of our track bar, right? This is not what we want. We want it to so that the center of the circle is aligned with the left. To be able to do that, I'm adding a transform, and I translate it to minus 50% of its width, right? So now you can see that the center of the circle is aligned over here, and I'm going to remove the opacity, right? So we pretty much have all the elements we need, and they are kind of styled. The next thing we would like to do is work on the interaction. So I need to have reference to some of the elements I have here in JavaScript. So I'm just going to create the slider container constant and say document.query selector, and it's going to be the slider container, right? The next thing I need the reference to is this progress, right? So I'm just going to copy this, paste it over here, call it progress or progress bar. You want to make sure that the name of your constants or variables are pretty self-explanatory. So I know that this is progress. And then I would also need to have a reference to my thumb. So here is my thumb, right? So starting, we need to make sure that we do it correctly. So imagine this percentage value is coming from the backend, or you want to send it to a backend and save this value for the next time. For example, let's say this is like a admin panel or whatever that needs to be loaded with the correct data for the user, depending on what this indicator is really visualizing, right? So let's define a variable called percentage, and let's say 50%, right? Now what we want to do, we want to manipulate or modify the values over here so that it actually shows 50% correctly. First thing I want to do is work on the uh, progress bar. So I would just say progress bar dot style dot transform. Now, this transform really needs to be in the center right now since it's 50%. So what I can do, I can use the scale, and then if I set the scale, for example, to 0.5, you can see that it basically has the scale of half of the bar, but we also need to make sure that in the CSS, when it comes to the progress, since we are modifying this, it has the transform origin of 0 so that it starts from here. So now you can see that it looks fine. I'm just going to go and increase the height of this to maybe 6 so that it's better visualized over here. Um, and I need to also make sure that the top, instead of -8, is maybe -7 so that it kind of aligns itself. The next thing I would like to do is, well, basically, we know that how to map this value to this. It's just we divide this by 100, right? So if I go here, we do a concatenation of the strings here, and then I would just add 50 divided by 100, right? So now you can see that supposedly this value scale x, progress bar style transform, scale x, obviously we forgot this one. So I'm just gonna make it correct. So the transformation is correct. Now we can see that it's the correct value over here. So instead of 50 here, I can do percentage, right? So this is fixed. When we have percentage 50, the bar actually shows correctly. Now, what about this one? We do have the reference to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do thumb.style.transform. This one needs to have translate, since we are translating it. But how much are we going to translate this, right? We need to translate it. Imagine that we have the width of the slider container over here. We need to translate it based on this percentage to half of that value. So again, I can use the same principle since I do concatenation here and here within my pluses over here. I'm going to do percentage, but I also need to multiply this value by the width of the slider control. So I need to have the width of the slider control. I'm going to create a constant slider container width equals to slider container offset width, right? So now if I multiply this value, which is half, by slider container, and I'm just going to go do this here and translate x. So supposedly this should work. Let's see what have we missed. So we have the slider container, everything looks fine. We get the offset width, which is the width of the container. And then we forgot to put pixel here, right? Because translate scale doesn't need the pixel. The value is from 0 to 1, but translate actually needs a pixel. So now you can see that based on the percentage value, we have initially the correct look of the slider control. So now I'm just going to create a function out of these two. So I'm just going to copy these. I'm just going to create function set percentage, and I'm going to paste those two lines over here. So depending on what percentage it is, whenever I call this, I expect this to work fine, right? I would obviously call set percentage initially so that initially I have the correct values. Now for the interaction, for moving this thumb, right? We need to add event listeners to the document. Initially, when we click here, when we press, we're gonna do thumb dot add event listener, and then we have mouse down. For the second parameter, we pass a function, and what we really want to do here is we want to set a variable called dragging. So I'm just going to create a variable dragging. Initially, I would like to put it false. I'm just going to move this variable up where the variables are, kind of cleaning up a little bit. So I have my constants, I have my variables. So I just want to, whenever I click on here, which is mouse down event, I want to make sure that the dragging here is set to true, right? Now, if I start attaching an event listener, so add event listener to the document with mouse move, now what I can get is actually very interesting. So if I console log this E, which is the event that is passed when we do mouse move, I'm opening the Chrome inspector here. If I start moving this, you can see that we already get the mouse event with the values we need. And what we're interested here is client X, right? So obviously we need to make sure that this mouse move operates when the dragging is true. So I will say if the dragging is true, which is if dragging, I would like to just console log, right? So now if I start just moving it, nothing happens. But as soon as I start clicking on the thumb, it just sets the dragging to true, and then this mouse move starts printing out the values to the console. As you can see, I clicked on this and then I'm starting to moving it. All right, sounds good. The next thing we want to do is obviously having the same event listener, but instead mouse up, where we actually set the dragging to be false, right? So we have three event listeners. When first one when we click on the thumb, the second one is when we move our cursor in the document, and the last one is when we, you know, sort of do the mouse up on the document, meaning that we just lift the uh, lift the mouse up. So now everything looks fine. If I want to show you, I'm going to click on this, move the mouse, and then I'll just release the mouse, and you can see now it's not really printing anymore. And that is exactly what we want. Now what are we going to do when we start the dragging? So first things first is that when we do the dragging, this event has a specific value or property called client X, right? And that client X really represents the position of the mouse on the x-axis from the initially from the start of the window, right? So now what I can do is defining this percentage based on that value and calling this set percentage to set the correct position of the thumb and also the progress bar. Now, how are we going to do that? So we're going to define a variable called translate. So var translate. I just want to see how much I translated in the x-axis. So here If I simply just say translate equals to e.clientx, it will give me the value of position of the mouse in the x-axis whenever I move it, right? I also need to consider the fact that the indicator is actually offsetted from the center over here, from the left over here. So I need to have that value as well. So I'm just going to go create a slider container left. It's going to be slider container dot offset left, right? So now here, if I in the mouse move, if I set the translate to eClientX minus slider container left, I actually pretty much get this correct value from the beginning of my slider, right? So now the only thing I need to do is, let me just switch to this layout so we have a better view over here. So now I could get the value, let me just save this. Uh, Now you will see that I get the value here in the mouse move. I get the value correctly, the translate value over here. And that translate value really is this one, right? I actually have this value. So how am I converting it to the percentage? Obviously, when we have this value, what we can do is come here and say, um, let's see. So if I have the translate, if I just come here and say style, I'm just going to just copy this. I'm just going to copy this here. Now, if I'm not going to call the function first, I'm just going to show you how we can modify the value so that when we call this function, we set the correct value. So here gives me the translate from the beginning of the track. So if I just do scale x, if I get the translate divided by the width of the container, so slider container width here, I'm just gonna make it correct value here with capital. Now, if I start moving it, you can see that it actually starts moving based on the value that I have, right? So basically this one will represent the percentage but multiplied by 100, right? So here I can easily say the percentage value is translate divided by the slider container, and ultimately these values multiply by 100, right? So now instead, I now know the value of the percentage. I just simply call set percentage, right? So now if I start dragging it, you can see that it actually starts doing the correct job, which is setting the value. We need to not forget the fact that the thumb itself was originally translated minus 50% of its width. So here in the JavaScript, when we are setting the translate x, we also need to the actual translate minus 50% as well. So now when we start moving it, you can see that it actually starts working correctly, but now we have corner cases. If I just follow along, you can see that it actually goes beyond the limit of our tracker, and that is easily fixable. What we need to do here, when we start the mouse move, we need to do a check. So if the e.clientx is less than slider container left, we just set the percentage to be 0, right? Else, if e.clientx is more than slider container width plus, we need to consider this offset as well, plus slider container left, then just set the percentage to be 100, right? Meaning that it's going to be over here. And else otherwise, which means that it's going to be in between the 0 and 100, we're going to set the percentage to the correct value. So which is this one, right? Okay. Now if we start dragging it, uh, let's see why it's not working. So we have e.client x, which is correct, is less than a slider container left. So I'm just going to correct the typo mistakes that I have over here. So let's see if this is the only one. No, I'm just gonna slider container left. We have slider container width and a slider container left here. And obviously everything looks fine. So now as you can see, if I go over less than the 0 or the beginning, it's not going to change the value. So it will be 0. And if I go more than this, you can see that it kind of caps it over there and doesn't move over here. So you can see that easily by playing with the transform scale and transform translate, we kind of got what we want, right? Which is the progress bar. One of the things I made here is that when you click on this, you can see that you have this nice kind of scaling effect that happens on the thumb. To be able to achieve that, what I can do is instead of thumb here, well, with the thumb inside it, I'm just going to create a thumb indicator, right? So I have a div thumb indicator, and in the CSS, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to style it. So slider container, and then thumb indicator. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say width 100 pixel, 100% of its parent, which is thumb, which is 20 pixel, and height of 100%, right? I will remove the background from this guy, which is thumb, to the thumb indicator. So now you can see that they pretty much got the same thing. I just need to also move the border radius to the thumb indicator. So pretty much the thumb becomes only the container of my thumb indicator. So everything looks correct, everything looks fine, but now I have the possibility to add a new class to the thumbs container. I'm just going to say thumbs container. Let me copy this class over here and just say focus. And then I would just scale it using transform. I'm just going to scale it to maybe something like 1.3 so it gets bigger. So now what I would like to do is whenever in the JavaScript I do mouse down, I want to give that add that class to my thumb indicator. So I need to have a reference to that as well. So thumb indicator, and then here I have thumb indicator. Here I can just simply say thumb indicator dot class list dot add focus, right? As easy as that. Now if I start doing this, you can see that it actually got scale a little bit bigger, and I also want to remove it when I do mouse up on my document. So I'm just going to remove it, right? So now you can see when I click, it becomes larger, and if I release the mouse, it goes back. Just to give it a little bit of a nice animation or transition, I'm just going to set the transition here to be all 0.3%, and also maybe change the opacity to something a little bit less, like 0.8, right? So now if I start it, you can see that we get, by the way, sometimes you get this effect here. It has the user select property. What we need to do is making sure that when we drag, we set the WebKit, since I'm in Chrome, WebKit user select to be none, right? So now if I start moving it, you can see that we don't have that sort of a problem that you saw before. Now you can see that when we click on it, it has this nice transition of the scale and opacity, and it works the way we wanted. And obviously now when we move it, we know that this value in JavaScript percentage will represent the actual percentage that we have. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you had any questions and comments, please go ahead and put them in the comment section. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do. Let me know if this tutorial was complex. and let me know, and let me give me please feedbacks to see if I can improve the way I teach these kind of stuffs. It was a pretty nice tutorial, and I wish you enjoyed it. I wish you again a very good day and night, and hopefully I'm gonna see you next time. Goodbye.